Okay, welcome to round 2, Rack Madness Day 2. Yesterday we knocked out a typical buck. Today we are doing a non-typical buck. A lot of tape on here, and most of that is for just explanation. My name is Wade Free. I'm the Assistant Director of the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. I've been measuring antlers for a long time. We have measures scattered all over the state, so if you're interested in getting your deer measured, be sure and contact a game warden or a department employee in your county or town, and they'll get you connected to somebody that can measure your deer for you. The purpose for today's measuring is to show you some basic techniques to be able to determine kind of what your buck scores, and it'll kind of get you in the ballpark and let you know if you need to get an official measure rounded up to put you in the Cy Curtis book, Oklahoma's record book, or maybe even Boone and Crockett. There's a lot going on with this rack, as you can see, and this one is actually a pretty basic non-typical. From some of the photos you've seen of deer harvested in Oklahoma, there are some really wacky non-typical. This one's fairly easy. We'll start out by saying the Cy Curtis program is the ODWC's program, and we use the Boone and Crockett measuring system. There's a typical category and a non-typical. The difference is in how you tally the points. You basically score the rack the same way, typical and non-typical. There's always a main frame, main beams with normal tines coming off the main beam, what we call the G measurement. So non-typical or typical scored the same. It's in how you add or deduct points for the net score that makes a difference. Someone asked, how do I know if my buck would be typical or non-typical? And that was actually asked of this one. You need about 12 to 15 inches plus abnormal points, which are the blue ones. Any point that comes off of a normal tine is abnormal. You can only have one set of brow tines. Anything coming off of brow tines, abnormal, blue. And then any kicker points off of a G1, 2, or 3, always abnormal points. Those add up and add into the score later. But for this buck, all the red tines are your typical points. So he's basically a main frame 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 by. So 6 by 6, that's good. So we'll start. I'm just going to pull off the red to make it a little cleaner. So if you see that buck out there in front of your stand, for all of you rack enthusiasts, folks that are addicted to whitetail antlers, deer hunting, and such, you can look at that thing and give me a guess. Make a comment to what you think that might score. Now, usually a buck doesn't give you that much time. It's like, whoo, and he's gone. But it's a pretty good look, and you'll get a pretty good guess. Everybody's a field judger, but it can be tough on a buck like this. So kind of figure out what you think, and at the end, I'll tell you what this thing scores. So I've actually put a tape to this, and I'm going to walk you through the process to kind of give you some information on details. There's lots of questions about, what is a tine, what's abnormal, how do you draw a baseline, how do you determine a tine? So we're going to get into some of that, and we'll just kind of follow the score sheet. So first thing I do is we've already done that. I know he's a 6 by 6, so I'm going to pull this red tape off. So we've identified the main tines, and a G1 or a tine is a tine that comes straight up off the center. You can get a little curve sometime, but center of the main beam. So no matter what angle you look at, coming off the center. If you've got tines that are coming off the side or the bottom, they're not typical. The next thing you look for is how do they pair up. So brow tines pair up, G1s. This would be the 2. Well, unfortunately, this G2 has to pair up with this one that was actually broken off. So it does have to pair with that, so there'll be some deducts. And then everything has to pair. So G1s, G2s, G3s, G4s, you're looking for not only a rising in the right part of the main beam, but they have to have a pair. So we've got that figured out. So I'll pull all the red off, which is going to make it look a little cleaner and easier to read if I can get this tape off. So now he's looking a little better. All right, so the next thing I do is draw my baselines, and I'll just go down each side. So right now we're drawing baselines on the typical frame. We're not worried about all the blue stuff yet. So you need a flexible tape, 1/4 inch, to do the job. Another thing we'll be using is a flexible cable, especially important when you're getting a main beam length, with a clip. And then a carpenter's rule. Good for tip to tip, greatest spread, inside spread, with the slide on it. So we'll show you how to do that. Okay, so I've drawn all my baselines. First thing I want to do is show you how you draw a baseline. So I'm just going to pick a 3 here. So everything starts from the top of the main beam. So the top of the main beam would be a line between this saddle and that saddle. So if you pan back, you can see there's some curvature here. So you lay your tape in there, right in the saddle, and that's where you draw the baseline, which you see it right there. So what some people do, if you go too high, you've cheated yourself out of a couple eighths. Everything is measured in eighths. If you go too low, you're actually exaggerating a little bit. So that would be too low. So you want it to lay in there just perfect on every tine. And every tine, including the abnormals, will have the same technique in drawing baselines. But for the typical points, they all come off the top. Here's a tough one. Sometimes it gets a little exaggerated. On the G2, there's a curve. So it can be too high or too low. So that exaggerates it. So again, you want to be on the curve of the antler. And it'll lay. See, that would be too high. I'm missing the backside. And I can lay that tape in there. About right there. So the baselines are establishing the lowest point on your tine, which we'll measure from to get tine length. So every time you do the same. So that's just how you draw baselines. And you do that for every point. Here is an abnormal that I'll just kind of show you. It's funky, it's coming off the inside, but you do have to measure that and then find a baseline. So it'll be the same kind of thing on that. You lay your tape in there. And it has to lay in there like so. Okay, so you know baselines now. Flexible steel tape, 1/4 inch, gets you there and measuring it accurately. So I'm just going to run through this real quick. On this deer, with all the baselines drawn, when I taped this one, we had a 5 1/8 G1, 10 2/8, 9 3/8, 8 and 1 6. And then I've done the same over here. So I've got all the measurements. Here's the unique thing about this rack, and this, not only is it bugging anyone that really loves antlers, it bugged the hunter that shot it, and that's that tine is missing because he had it on, and you can see how fresh that break was. Don't know if it broke it right after he shot it, and he broke it off when he fell or what, but we have to score to the break. And anytime you have a broken point, you can only score to the break. And on this one, the highest point would be where you score to, which would be that tip right there. So you actually have a comparison here. You got a 10 and 2 inch G2 on the left and a 4 and 6 on the right. So going to be a serious deduct right there. And that's just like, ouch, that hurt. Okay, so we've got all the tines measured, and they'll go onto the score sheet. Another thing about measuring, typical and non-typical, is you deduct, for symmetry, the difference between the paired points. So if you had 2 brow tines of 7 inches each, you've got 14 inches. If one of them is a little shorter, you get the total, but you have to take that difference off. That's just symmetry. You do the same for a non-typical, and that is symmetry for the main frame, okay? All right, so the next thing I do, we've already done it, is identify all these abnormal points. So this buck has 1, 2, 3, and believe it or not, 4 on the backside. So why all the tape? Well, when you're measuring and keeping track of, 30 or 40 different measurements and main frame points versus abnormal, it's hard to keep up with it. So what measures will do is they will tape that point and then pull the tape off. They know they've got it. Measure that point, you see the baseline, they pull the tape. So as you're going along scoring, and I've already marked those and measured them, you pull them off and you know you've got them taken care of. Show you something here that's kind of interesting. Maybe something you run into is kind of almost a palmation. So it's like, where do you draw the baseline on something like that? And the key to that is you still, when one side's palmed, you got to use the main antler tine. So there's, you wouldn't want to be up here. So you're down here along that main beam as we talked on the other side. So this buck has 4 abnormals on one side and 3 on the other. So you got a total of 12 inches of abnormal points. That's getting close to getting you up there in that non-typical category. You'd like to see 15 plus or more. We've measured some bucks that are up in the 20, 30 plus inches of abnormal, and that really racks up points. And how does it rack up points? It's because it adds into the score, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Okay, so let me get all the blue off these abnormals. So I've gone over identifying the points, typical and abnormal, and baselines and how you measure those. You just take your flexible tape and put it on the baseline and run it up the outside curve. Sometimes you have to grab it to hold it in place. And then you go to the tip on the curve. So that one's 8 inches. Okay, on a tine like this, where it can get in the way, if you've got one that really is just blocking your measurement, you can use calipers to measure to, from, and in between, but on this one you can go right up along the side of it. So we've got all the abnormals measured, we've got all these tines measured. The other thing you look at and measure is inside spread. Where do I do inside spread? You see people going up here between the tines, but the inside spread is always between the main beams, center of the main beam, and it needs to be level. You sometimes see antlers that have a higher main beam. I'll show you, for example. Sometimes you got a deer that one main beam is up higher than the other, and it ends up with an angled measurement. So you end up putting a square in there, or a level so you can get your slide rule or your slide on your tape straight across and level. We measured this one. The buck is kind of surprising. You can probably guess what his inside is, but it kind of threw me a little bit. It is 17 2/8. I just looking at that rack at first, I thought he'd been 18 inches, but 7 2/8, dead center at the widest point between the main beams. And I did mention everything is in 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so there's a couple other measurements that don't count into the score, but they're taken for reference, and that is tip to tip and greatest spread. If you have a Boone and Crockett buck or Cy Curtis, those measurements will have to be taken. If you just want to find out what your buck scores, you don't have to mess with that. If it's done officially, you will have to do that. So tip to tip is measured with the carpenter's rule from the center to the center. So you got 4 2/8. You got 4 2/8. Tip to tip. Again, doesn't factor into the score. Why am I taking that measurement? Doesn't make any sense. It's for reference. When we get your buck measurement, your forms in, we can look at that, and sometimes you'll get some really wacky measurements, and then you'll be able to tell by the tip to tip and greatest spread, whoa, that buck's got a 29-inch inside spread, but he only has a 22 outside. Something's up, so it's for reference. The way you do it officially on the outside spread is put it up against the wall or something, flat surface. I'll just move it over here. For example, this isn't just super high tech right here, but you put the buck up against the wall, and then you take a level on the widest point, level it, otherwise it wouldn't be doing the purpose. And then you measure from the wall to the level. So this one's 21.5 outside spread. So the greatest spread's 21.5. Again, reference only. Okay, so main beam length. Main beams really are the biggest challenge in my mind because that's where you can get error. This one, for you antler fanatics, probably know has some great main beam length, but if you're field judging that buck, it can throw you a little bit because of the curve. So you can see the curve. But if you straighten those main beams out, they would be good ones. So I'm just going to tape one real quick. And I like to tape a main beam a couple times because you can be off just a tick. Someone asked, what do you do if you think you might have a state record, and how does that work out? If you think you might have a potential record, non-typical, get a hold of the Wildlife Department, Game Warden, Wildlife Department employee, and in the case of a potential state record, we always panel score those. So your local guy could measure that thing, and if it looks like it's going to be the next state record, we will panel score that for you. And we're all about that. We love it. Okay, so flexible cable, and you want to drop this in. If you were just out there at deer camp and you had this flexible tape, you could put it in there and work it around the main beam. I'm sure most of you have done that, but it's hard. I'm going to just show you, even though this is not acceptable with Boone and Crockett or Cy Curtis, but if you were at deer camp, you really want to know what that thing scores. You lay your tape in there, and since this is a rack of my buddies, I can mark on it. He's not going to beat me up. Okay, so 4 inches, and then pivot it, and then you have to keep marking it 6 inches so you can get that curve. It's hard to do with the tape, but it'll get you in the ballpark versus just trying to wrap a tape around there. So back to the cable, the official way of doing it. You just hook that in, and it's in line, center of the main beam, kind of on the outside, above the eye orbit. Okay, can you see how that lays in there? Probably right there might be better, just right there. Okay, now the key is, some people wrap this cable too far back. If you wrap it too far back, it inflates the score. If you go too shallow, it cuts you out of some inches. So this one's kind of tricky because the main beam's a little twisted. But I'm just following that bloodline right there. And then you go right down the center of the main beam. Where is center? A good reference is the bottom of the main beam between the baseline and the bottom, which would be about right in there. And then you just work that down with your finger. If you had a helper, they would usually just be holding it for you as you went along. But for this purpose, you just need a little coordination and just keep working it right down the center. If you're doing it by yourself, you can even tape that right there. Tape it to the, you just put a piece of tape on there if you had to. Okay, so I'm going on around down the center. And then you bring it to the very end. And that moved a little bit, but and then you just clip it. Well, then what you do, there's my main beam length, and that's a good one. I said yesterday a good main beam length is, upper 20s, 24, 25, 26, and this buck had 27 and 27 and 7/8 main beam, so that's a great main beam length. So then when you get that measured and clipped, you just lay it on your carpenter's rule, and he's pushing 27, yep. So that was my 27 and 7/8 measurement. So he's got 27 and 27 and 7/8. That's great main beam lengths. Okay, so we've covered points, on the Boone and Crockett score sheet, and I'll just kind of show you this score sheet real quick. You do record number of points right and left, and that includes the abnormal points. Tip to tip, greatest spread, and then the inside spread, which is your credit that you'll get that'll be added in. So you've got your main beams, all your G's, then you got to do circumferences, which is your H measurements. And if you look on this score sheet, some of you may be looking at a score sheet, but right here is the length of your points. That's your G measurement, so the length of all the normal points. And then you have 4 circumferences. I'll kind of show you how to do those. So we've got the length of the main beams. We've added in all the abnormal points up there in the abnormal column, which totals 12. So left side, H1, you can see this almost goes where I need it. It's bent in the right position, but it's the smallest circumference. And the first H is taken between the burr and the brow tine. Burr and the G1. So you just take your tape, and what's great about these tapes, and you can get them from Boone and Crockett, and you get probably all these measuring supplies from them as well, is it's got a blank here with a hook that lets you hold on to it. And it's a little more easy to work with and handle than a regular tape, because when you wrap that thing around, there it is, there's your measurement, versus you've got your thumb on the first inch or so of a regular tape. So we're looking for the smallest, and you want to work around all these gnarly points, because sometimes that tape will just lay in there and there it is. If you're going around these guys, it inflates the measurement. So we're going to go back here. See, there's 4 2/8. You get down in here and it's grown some. So there we go. It's 4 2. So that's H1. Then between the brow and the G, G1 and the 2 is the next one. Same thing, smallest place. See how that just changed? I thought I had him at 3 and 6, but it fell in about, oops. Okay, that one's right in between. If you're right in between, the rack gets the benefit. So we'd bump that one up to 4 and 5. It's right in the middle. Okay, so H1, H2, H3, H4. That's your circumferences, and that is giving you mass. This buck has a 4 and 2. A 4-inch plus is a great base measurement, H1, but some of the bigger bucks, the older 6, 7, 8-year-olds, they can get up 6, 7-inch bases. Bases also are a great field judging criteria. Bases are one of the first things I look at after I see width and height. And you can have some really wide, spindly, tall bucks that on first glance look like good ones. Look down at the bases and it's just not there. 3-inch base is a young deer. 4 inches, cutting it close. But when you get up in 5, 6 and bigger, those are definitely mature bucks. Believe it or not, this buck was only 4.5 years old. And who knows what he would have looked like next year if he would have survived. Neighbors, everybody's like, oh, I don't know if I should have shot him or not. I hate that tines broke off, but if you don't get him, the neighbor might. So who would pass that buck up anyway? Okay, so we've got everything. You do 4 H's on each side. Main beam lengths, tine lengths, inside spread, greater spread, tip to tip, and then you lay all that thing out, on a measurer's score sheet. And what this buck ends up doing is 17 2/8 inside spread, and his right and left side, one side is 72 6/8, one side is 79 2/8, which gives him a subtotal of 169 2/8.
Someone guessed 175.
What's that?
Someone guessed 175.
That's pretty dang good. Okay, so his subtotal is 169. Okay, so that is the typical frame. Well, we had to do symmetry differences, just like we would on a typical deer. So the difference between the G1s, the G2s, see, this really hurt him, like 5 inches. But the total differences between the left and right side on symmetry is 9 2/8 inches. Well, that kind of hurt. So that knocked that buck down to 160. Okay, so he went from 169 2/8 to 160 because he had a 9 2/8 deduct. But on a non-typical buck, you get to add all those abnormals back in. So he had 12 inches of those. So he ends up adding 12 in, 172. And what was that guess?
175.
Okay, that guy knows what he's doing, or gal. So the buck is 172. The real tough part is if this tine would have been even close to symmetrical, that buck was 181. So that's a 180 deer when you're looking at that thing out on the field. And a lot of guys, they ask, what's the difference between Boone and Crockett, Cy Curtis, and gross? Well, a lot of guys only do gross. They're not worried about symmetry and all these deductions. They want to know what did that deer grow and what does it total. So in that case, all you're doing is main beams, tine lengths, circumferences, adding in all the tine lengths, all the abnormals, and everything just adds in. So gross is everything added in with no deducts for symmetry. So non-typical, measured the same as a typical. The only difference is you add the abnormals that are coming off of places where they don't belong into the score. Okay, that doesn't make much sense. It does if you consider it takes 150 Cy-Curtis for a non-typical, 135 typical. So you can see if you start adding in and going for a non-typical score, you have to have a higher minimum. So that's the difference. Anyway, a great buck, representative of Oklahoma. We appreciate you guys, gals, and all you do, not only for the resource, but the wildlife department, but keep them coming. Get out there. There's no better, more passionate and hard-working group than deer hunters, and I know I'm talking to a bunch of them, and I am one myself, and there is nothing more exciting than deer antler. It's kind of crazy, but it's great. Thank you.